Hi YouTube, in a recent video I set up a Robinson mercury vapor moth trap in my garden to see what moths I could get. This is the best of all of them. This is a Privet Hawk moth. It's the largest native moth in Britain. We do get a couple of larger moths. There's the Convolvulus hawk moth and the death's head hawk moth, but they're migrants, they come in from another country. So in this video I'm going to keep this moth for a couple of days and allow her to lay eggs. And then I'm going to hatch out all the eggs and I'm going to rear up all the caterpillars to pupa stage so I can show you the whole process step by step. So I decided to keep her in one of these mesh cages. It's a very tall hanging one, and I thought I'd keep her for a couple of days for her to lay eggs. If she doesn't lay any eggs, I'll just release her again. Luckily she did end up laying eggs, but you'll see in a second that even after 2 days her wings have become really quite tatty. That's because these moths only live for perhaps a week in their sort of adult stage, so very short-lived as an adult moth. And it's just inevitable that they're going to become a bit tatty. Even in a cage as soft as this, she's managed to kind of damage her wings quite a lot. But you'll see here she's laid about 100 eggs. This is because I put a jar of privet in the bottom of this cage, and she can sense that there's privet there, and this kind of stimulates her to lay all her eggs. Okay, so this is how I keep all the eggs, just in a little tub with a few privet leaves just to keep a slight amount of humidity in the tub. And you'll see after just a couple of days, little tiny caterpillars hatch out. And they are really delicate at this stage, really tiny little things. You can see here compared to my fingernail, absolutely tiny. So you've got to be very careful with these. If you're going to move them around, do it with a very delicate little paintbrush or something to move them about. You can see here I put a few on some privet, but they're quite hard to keep track of at this stage because they're so small. They're really actually quite difficult to see, especially if they line themselves up with like a vein on a leaf or something. They become really tricky to see, really well camouflaged. So I think I end up actually moving these so they're not on a big plant like this anymore, but just rear them up in a smaller tub. So keeping them in a tub is a much better way of doing it. The only thing with this is obviously normally you stand up privet in a jar of water. If you're laying your privet down, what you do is just take a few stems of privet, wrap them in some damp kitchen paper, and then wrap the damp kitchen paper in a bag. Tie it all up with like a hairband or an elastic band or something. And then you can see all the eggs down the end there. When they hatch, all the little baby caterpillars will climb up onto the privet. Then the whole tub has got these kind of small mesh areas. And even with that, I've ended up putting tape over to cover up most of it, just to keep some humidity in. You don't want too much humidity, otherwise, water droplets will form and the caterpillars will drown. But you don't want them to be too dry either, because you want the plant to remain nice and fresh. And I just put a cable tie in the middle here just to secure the lid in place. And then that's good for a couple of days, and then I have to replace the privet again. You have to replace the privet pretty regularly to keep the caterpillars happy. Okay, this is when all the little babies have hatched out of the eggs. What you'll notice is once they hatch out of the egg, they'll also eat their eggshell as their first meal. So they're okay straight away, but then very quickly they start taking little tiny nibbles of these privet leaves. And you can see just the occasional notch out of the edges of these leaves. That's where they've started feeding. And you'll see little black specks here and there. That's just their droppings. And you'll see those get bigger and bigger as the caterpillars get bigger. Right, this video is taken only 2 or 3 days later, and you can see how quickly these caterpillars grow. They've got quite a bit bigger already. You can see some really quite big ones in here. What I do is, when I'm cleaning them out, you'll see the caterpillars obviously are clinging to the leaves, and rather than try and get them off, because they're so delicate at this stage, what I tend to do is just cut little strips of leaf with the caterpillar still on it, and then just add these little strips of old leaf in with the new leaves. The caterpillars very quickly will climb up onto the fresh leaves because they can sense that they're fresher, and they'll start eating the fresh leaves, and then you can just tweezer out all of the little strips of old leaf. And you'll see here like little bits on the edges of some of these leaves where the caterpillars have been having a good munch. You can tell as well when a caterpillar is going to shed its skin, because the head section sort of moves forward on the head, and then they've got a new head underneath it. And so that's something to look out for, because obviously when they're at that stage they're sort of dormant, they're not eating, and it's best not to disturb them anyway. So again, this is a couple of days later. You can see now most of them are as big as the bigger ones were before. Some of them have started to develop stronger stripes down the sides, and they're looking much more like little proper hawk moth caterpillars. You can see here next to my finger just how big some of these are, getting quite a bit bigger. And also same technique still. As soon as like the leaves start to look really chomped, I just cut the caterpillars off with little strips, or if they're on a section of branch, I just snip a bit of branch off and add them in. You can see that guy's looking particularly big compared to some of the others. But you'll find that you get loads and loads of droppings, because the caterpillars are just little eating machines. They're chomping all the edges of the leaves. The leaves don't last long really, so you definitely do need to be replacing your leaves like every day or every other day at least. And I did hear that if you keep some hawk moth caterpillars, here look, you can see a whole load of droppings and stuff. This is what it looks like when you've just cleaned them out. Take all of those horrible droppings out, give it a good wipe around, and put all the fresh stuff in. Yeah, I did hear that if you leave some hawk moth caterpillars and their leaves aren't fresh, then the actual caterpillar can get a bacterial infection and die. So I would recommend thoroughly either replacing your leaves every day or at least every other day. Don't leave it for 3 days, just in case. You could be risking all your caterpillars. So here you can see like this one shed its skin again. It's got the purple stripes down the edge, and it's starting to look really nice now. So the scientific name for this particular species, the Privet Hawk Moth, is Sphinx ligustri, and that's because the caterpillars will rest in a very distinctive way with their front legs kind of reared up, and this one is not doing it at the moment, but I'll show you on some later on when that happens. Okay, you probably noticed I switched to a taller tub now, and the caterpillars, again, this is just a couple of days later, have doubled in size. That tends to be the case. They tend to double in size every couple of days. With this particular tub, I'm just using a bit of mesh over the top like this, and that gives them lots of ventilation, but then it's a bit too much ventilation. So then what I do again is just put a bag over most of the top like this, and then put the lid on over the top. You can see there's just then a couple of strips of ventilation at either side. Most of it is covered in the middle to keep the humidity up a little bit. Okay, this is a couple of days later again, and all the caterpillars are looking a lot chunkier now. There's one caterpillar in here that I was going to show you in particular, which is one where it's got its head looking like the head is jutting forward. What this actually is a head that is just about to be shed off, and underneath that head that looks like it's kind of propped forward, there's a new head already under the skin, and that's the one that's going to be popping out when he finally sheds. Okay, here I've moved to an even bigger tub. At this stage all the caterpillars are pretty hardy. You can see this cage has just got a mesh screen lid here. It doesn't matter so much about the ventilation because there's so many leaves in there now that the humidity kind of keeps up by itself. So you still get the odd caterpillar here that's a bit smaller and a bit sort of runtier looking than the rest. This one here is still pretty tiny, but you can see it's just shedding its skin. You can see I think it's nibbling its old head there, and then you can see the skin halfway off down its body. The rest of the caterpillars in here are looking pretty nice and chubby now. Some of them have done an extra shed, and their dorsal stripes are becoming much stronger. They're really dark purple now. It's really vivid against the white stripes. And also their tails look much kind of glossier now. and their heads have got this really glossy black stripe down the side of the head. Really pretty looking caterpillar at this stage, and they get even more impressive as they get bigger, but this is where they start to look pretty impressive. Because the caterpillars get through the leaves so fast now, I've still got some wrapped in damp kitchen paper and carrier bags to keep them watered, but other stems I've just literally propped in here. And all I do is just, by the end of the day, all of the leaves will have disappeared and there'll just be stems left, and then I'll just go out and get some more privet. I'm quite lucky, I don't actually have a privet hedge of my own, but I've got probably 11 or 12 privet hedges in my street, so I'm able to just take snips from here and there and get permission from a few neighbours. I thought I'd show you this tub where everything's been about half eaten. You can see loads of droppings at the bottom of the cage, but all the caterpillars are much more obvious when the leaves have all been eaten. This is how they look on the stems. So you'd never probably see this in the wild, I wouldn't imagine, because the moths, I think they fly around, and the moths probably just lay a couple of eggs on each privet hedge and then fly on to the next one. So if you're ever going to see these in the wild, you'll probably just see 1 or 2 caterpillars at a time, I would imagine. Okay, so a couple of days later again, and they've suddenly become a lot greedier. I don't know why this is, but they just seem to be wanting to eat all the time. So if you look here as well, they're not only eating the leaves, but you can see them eating the ends of the stems, which just means that their jaws now are much stronger to be able to chew these they're quite woody branches, that these are eating. So quite impressive. But you can see this is not sped up in any way. You can see just how fast they're actually going for it. As you can imagine, at this stage I'm having to go out and collect privet a lot more than I did before. Sometimes I'm having to collect it twice a day. Here's a pile of their droppings, which are also pretty impressive now. They actually smell really nice, I quite like them. But you can see in here as well, there's a shed skin, little white shed skin that I'll just show you. So you can see they all shrivel up, because as they peel out of the skin all wrinkles up like concertinas. I really like the idea of just getting a whole load of privet stems and putting them in a bottle of water, so you can see all the caterpillars hanging out. Look how chunky they are now, they're absolutely massive. If I just hold my index finger here, you can see how big it is in comparison to my finger. Really fat and swollen, and they're getting through so much privet at the moment. If you ever decide to keep your caterpillars like this, make sure you put all of the stems of privet in really densely into the bottle of water, and then maybe wedge a carrier bag or something in there as well, so that no caterpillars can crawl down the stems and accidentally drown themselves in the water. That can happen. Also be careful if you're keeping your caterpillars out loose like this. They can occasionally obviously fall off the stem, or try and crawl down and then just drop to the floor, and then they'll crawl off and you'll lose them. So make sure if you are keeping them like this that you also keep them inside a tub as well. Here's some munching footage. It's a real shame, but at this point you could actually hear them munching, but I detached all of the audio while I was editing this video, so you can't actually hear them. But you'll just have to take my word for it that when you've got a lot of caterpillars all munching at the same time, it was actually quite a noisy experience. I thought you all might appreciate this bit of footage of one of them having a jolly good little nosh. These really are like little eating machines. They just exist, literally just to eat and poop, and that's about it. Here's one of them next to my finger again, just to give you the idea of the scale. Pretty massive caterpillars. This is what you end up with after a day of munching, just a whole load of stems. I thought I'd put one of these against a tape measure just to show you how long they are. So you can see they're approximately 8 centimeters long, but they're also really chunky, so I thought I'd turn this one around this way as well, so you can see just how wide they are. So if you have a look, you can see that they're probably about 1 centimeter wide, maybe 12 millimeters, something like that. So pretty chunky caterpillar. So when the caterpillars are pretty much fully grown, their droppings are absolutely massive. Quite impressive things. If you look at it here, you can compare it to the size of my fingernail. But they have these kind of ridges down the edges that mean that from the end they look like little kind of star shapes. Quite interesting looking things. They always remind me of like a little hand grenade or something like that. I've sped this bit up so you can see the leaf disappearing, but you can see how the caterpillar works its way sort of up and down past the central vein of the leaf. It's quite fascinating to watch how they do it. So I started putting the privet like this in our bath. This just meant if any caterpillars fell off, they wouldn't get lost anywhere because they couldn't climb out of the bath. This was quite a good way of doing it. Okay, I'll speed this bit up just so you can see the caterpillar munching a bit faster than it would normally. I mean, they eat fast enough in real life, but this gives you an even better idea. And then I'll show you what the stems look like just a few hours later after they'd had a jolly good munch. So you can see they've completely demolished this plant. There's just a few leaves left. The caterpillars have gone quite still because they're all nicely fed now. That won't last very long before they want to eat again. But you can see there's loads of droppings all over the bottom of the bath. And it's just a case of sweeping these all up with a dustpan and brush and then putting new leaves in, ready for the next feed the following day. So for a couple of days towards the end, I actually just kept them like this in the bath. Just laid out a whole load of stems of privet all the way on the bottom of the bath and then put the caterpillars on top. At this point they were getting through so much privet, they were probably eating a whole bin bag full of privet between them each day. So loads. And I would just stack up all the dead stems of privet at the end for the caterpillars to crawl under if they wanted to pupate. Here you can see a dustpan full of droppings. That's what they were producing each day. So when the caterpillars are fully grown and ready to pupate, they'll start to turn a different colour. So if you look at this one, you can see the back has gone a sort of a purplish brown kind of colour. The caterpillars will then also start coming off of their branches and start wandering about. This one as well, because we're looking at it so closely, you can see the pumping action of the blood going down the vertebral line. The heart runs all the way along the back. At this stage I like to separate each individual caterpillar into a separate tub to allow them to pupate. This is what the tub looks like. I just fill it with soil from the garden, press it down a little bit so it's firm in certain places. Sometimes I'll put my finger down just to make a hole somewhere, and then the caterpillar will crawl down into the hole, and that'll be the start of where it burrows down to make a little chamber for it to turn into a pupa. I just stacked individual tubs like this with caterpillars ready to pupate and then just waited for them to burrow down and pupate. Okay, at the end I managed to get this other tub, which is the tub that I normally use for taking my armadillo on holiday. It's my armadillo travel tub, but I repurposed it for this so that I could rear up the caterpillars just through their end stages. You'll see lots of them wandering about at this point with their sort of purpley brown backs looking to pupate. So every time I saw one like this, I would just take it out, put it in an individual tub and let it turn into its chrysalis. So I don't think any of the caterpillars could have crawled out of this tub because it's quite high up, but just to be on the safe side I put a lid on like this, just so I knew they definitely couldn't. So after they'd been in their individual tubs with soil in for a few days, I tipped them all out. So some of these you'll see they look like a chrysalis but they're green. They're ones that have just shed their skin and they're just starting to harden. When they fully harden, obviously they go a nice dark brown colour. But you'll see the ones over this side, they've shriveled up, but they still look like caterpillars. They've still got the tail on. So they're not going to be able to walk anywhere anymore because they've shriveled up just to this smaller size. But they're going to shed their skin one last time and then they'll be a chrysalis. So a couple of days later, this is what they all end up looking like. All nice and hardened. They've all got this nice dark brown colour and they're ready to be overwintered, and then they'll hatch out next June into lovely adult moths. So here you can see one of the final molts. So the last time the caterpillar shed its skin, this is what it looks like. I'll probably keep a couple of those just as specimens. But we've ended up with about 70 chrysalis here, just over 70. I ended up taking a load of the caterpillars to a show, so I sold about 20 at the show, and that's actually a really good idea, just to kind of spread the caterpillars out to other people. So you can give some to kind of friends and family and other people to rear up as well. It just means that if anything really bad ever happened to all your caterpillars or chrysalis, at least some might end up getting back into the wild. I'm hoping though that all of these will be overwintered and I'll be able to hatch out 70 adult moths and then release them back into the wild. And it's really good for the wild populations of privet hawk moths. If you imagine, like, the tiny little caterpillars that we hatched out of eggs, if they'd have been out in the wild on privet, you think how few of those would actually survive? Very few, because most of them get eaten by birds or other insects and things like that, or they get parasitized by parasitic wasps. I've had it quite a few times where I've caught a wild hawk moth caterpillar, taken it home to rear it up, and then some little tiny horrible maggot type things have ended up hatching out of the caterpillar, and that's from a parasitic wasp. Right, so you can see here what I do with the chrysalis is I spray them really thoroughly like this, and I'll probably do this every 2 or 3 days. It's very important because the worst thing for chrysalis is if you let them dry out and you just end up, they stop wiggling and they just harden and they're just dead inside. That would be horrible. So you've got to keep them nice and moist. So I'll do this, like I say, every 2 or 3 days. The actual tub, because it's got some ventilation holes, obviously they need air, but it's going to be quite humid inside here with the lid on, and that'll be quite nice. The other important thing obviously is not to keep them indoors at room temperature, but to keep them either outdoors or in a shed or something where they're sort of outdoor temperatures. That way they'll overwinter more naturally. It's important not to let them freeze or anything if it gets snowy over the winter. Obviously make sure if they are outside that they're not in full sunshine, because if the tub gets heated up that could kill them as well. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed this video. I've certainly enjoyed rearing up these privet hawk moth caterpillars. I did find a privet hawk moth once on a fence in Bournemouth, and I did the same thing where I kept her and she laid some eggs, and I did exactly what I've just shown you here. But it was nice to do it all over again and film it all as I went along. Yeah, check out my other videos, other animals and things that I keep, and hit subscribe to see anything that I post up in the future. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.